to succeeding in communicating, not only the sounds, not only the sounds.
Hello from London, and today I'd like to share the first part of a recording of my guest appearance on Gary McCann's My Language Challenge programme. Gary set up this programme for learners of all sorts of different levels, all sorts of different languages, to set goals 3 months hence, and then to share their experiences and to report back to the group about how they're doing. He also sets them mini challenges within the 3-month period of the group challenge as a whole. I decided I'd talk about the idea of tuning in to your target language. And today we'll begin with the part of the talk where I was talking about the actual sound of the language. It's not only pronunciation, but things like stress, intonation, and the rhythm of the language. So let's dive straight in.
My name's Gareth Popkins from howtogetfluent.com. I've been blogging about language learning for the last 4 years. I've been learning languages for about 30 years. I started with French, the usual story, at school, and went on to learn Welsh and German and Russian. More recently, I've dabbled in other languages, but I've been working on Basque. And also now I've started learning Japanese. And I've done some language teaching in my time too, both of English and Welsh. I go to a lot of polyglot events and talk to a lot of language learners. And one of the things you realize, I think, pretty quickly is that there are many, many different methods which people use when they're learning a language, to do with mainly, I think, your personality, whether you're more the introverted, perhaps hard-focused, studious type, cautious type, socially maybe, and those who are more extrovert and like to dive straight in, work it out as they go, build the parachute on the way down sort of thing. And there are differences. Do people like to use textbooks? Do they find that's too restrictive? Do they like to use a lot of video materials or not? Do they want to use technology? A gamut of methods, but I think there are similarities too. If you take a step back, there are certain things that we all need to do, that we all need to know when we learn a language. And fundamentally, I think our brains, in some senses, as regards learning, are all very similar too. People talk about learning styles, but from what I've been reading, that is to some extent perhaps a bit of a red herring, perhaps a bit exaggerated, because forming the neural connections, the memories, getting the active skill of language, of acquiring new speech really, it seems more or less the same for everybody, you know, in many important ways. So even if, as I say, we all have different, preferences into things we're actually doing. So what I've been doing is trying to think and isolate principles which I see all successful language learners applying maybe in varied ways, but under the surface. And I wanted to talk today about one of those, and I've called it the idea of tuning in to your foreign language. So that's the topic that I want to talk about today. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, there are 3 aspects to this, I think. The first one is what I'd call the soundscape of the language. So it's literally the idea of tuning in your ears and your brain to how the language sounds. And then the second one is tuning in to the way the language is used socially. This is what the linguists call the pragmatics of using a language. And I'll go on to look at that a bit briefly and explain what that is and what you can do to make sure you're not making sort of social faux pas with your language. You're not embarrassing yourself by, for example, using the wrong form, impolite or informal or polite form, vous, tu, when you're learning French, something like that. And then the final aspect of tuning in is the cultural one. Pragmatics sort of blends into that, but it's knowing about the culture that comes with the language that you're learning. And that, of course, is a multifarious thing as well. But to really understand and to succeed in communicating, you need not only the sounds, not only the social conventions, but you need a whole lot of context, and that's the culture. So those are the 3 aspects of this tuning in aspect as a guiding principle of language learning. So I'll start first with a little bit about the first one, which is what I called the soundscape. Now, language is sound, obviously, at the most fundamental level. You can get fluent in a language and by being illiterate. Of course, that's the way that all of us learned our first language. And to my mind, it's very good advice to take how your language sounds and learning to pronounce the language well, to get the intonation right, to take that really, really seriously. And some language learners, like to put a lot of emphasis, certainly at the beginning, on getting those fundamentals right. And then I think I like to do that, even though it's a bit boring and frustrating if you've got a textbook. One is tempted to skip over the first pre-chapter on pronunciation, for example. But I think it does pay off, because if you are difficult to understand, it's going to make it hard for people to help you, actually, because it's frustrating for them, particularly when our first language is English, and many people speak English quite well as a second language. They might switch into English, but also not only in a conversation, but if you're listening, of course, and that's one of the ways of getting a lot of audio input, building the depth of your knowledge, widening your vocabulary, then you will hear better too if you focus a bit initially on the basic sounds. So whether you do it at the beginning, whether it's something you do later, or whether it's something that you come back to, and that I think is another good useful tip, that you can have just a corrective session occasionally. If you do if you work with a tutor, you can just maybe have one session where just for half an hour, or even a shorter time, you speak and they pick up certain aspects of your pronunciation which they feel that you could work on. Or you can ask a friend, a native speaker friend, to help you with that too, because generally people you're speaking to will probably accept in that context, be polite, and they will not be correcting your pronunciation necessarily, because either they're not thinking about that, or that they don't want to offend you. So one of the key things in a soundscape is the elemental sounds, the so-called the phonemes, the contrastive sounds. Language is built up of contrasts, in a way, of sound. And you have elemental sounds, which may or may not be present in English. So, and then in the language that you're learning, the sound may be cut up, if you like, in different ways, packaged in different ways. This is partly acoustic, but it's partly also what the brain is tuned into. And if like in Spanish, for example, I know Spanish speakers, I know when they're speaking English, they tend to mix up B and V. So they talk about video. I say you've got to, don't mix your vowels with your vowels, I say to my Catalan housemate, because this distinction B and V in Spanish is not a contrastive phonemic difference. They're what they call allophones of the same phoneme. So this distinction doesn't matter for meaning. Whereas in English, there's a big difference between vowel and vowel, between ship and sheep, these sounds, the E sound, which doesn't exist in Spanish. Likewise, in other languages, we have two versions of L in the word in an English pronunciation, little. Our brains tell us that's the same sound at the beginning and at the end. But actually, it isn't. I'm not an expert of phonetics, but the second one is different from the first one. And in some languages like Polish, that distinction is important for meaning. So the word starts with one of the L's or starts with the other L, it changes the meaning. So you need to focus in on that, read the pronunciation section of your book, learn about these things and work on them occasionally. And then it's the same with stress, So where is there a stress pattern in your language? English has stress on different syllables that can move. In French, you tend to stress each syllable more or less equally. And that's a great way to sound like a French person if you give the same emphasis to every syllable in the sentence, yeah? And once you're aware of that, you can start doing what's required of you in your language. In Russian that I learned, the stress is a nightmare, is mobile stress, they call it, so that it moves. um, um, we have that sometimes in English, don't we, to distinguish between a noun and a verb. But in Russian, the stress can move according to whether it's a plural or the case that it's in, and it's an irregular thing. It's something you want to be aware of and to focus on. Consonant combinations as well, they can differ. So, for example, we have consonant clusters at the end of a sentence in English. In Cantonese, you don't have that. So they might say girl, because to say girl, two consonants at the end is difficult for them. I have this again all the time with my Catalan housemate, that she is not saying a double consonants at the end of a word in English, because she's not used to it. When I'm speaking Basque, I'm using a long R at the end. I'm sort of diphthongizing the R at the end, because in English that's what we tend to do, whereas it should say short. And so be aware of the differences between your own language and the one you're learning. The same with the rhythm of the language, as I mentioned, with the intonation. The meaning of intonation can differ between languages. We can raise our intonation for a question. In Hungarian, the intonation falls at the end. There's a bit of a down and up at the end. And then also, tones. Some languages have tones. Chinese, Cantonese, some African, Zulu has tones, 2 tones. So those are things you need to focus in on too. How connected speech works. That when we're speaking syllables in the whole word, we sometimes crunch the syllables. So, for example, Birmingham we say in English, the place name, not Birmingham. So the A at the end, Birmingham, just about disappears. It's the sort of thing you might not notice. Find out what's going on in your own language.
That then is the first part of my concept of tuning in. It's the soundscape of the language. Pretty soon here on the Thoughts on Thursday slot, I'll be posting the rest of the talk I gave to Gary's group, when I want to look at 2 other aspects of tuning in language learning. So I hope to see you then. As always, don't forget to subscribe for the vibe, think about a thumbs up, tickle that bell, and share the affair. See you again soon. Bye.